You're now watching Wayback Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
So glad you could be with us tonight. Got a lot of ground to cover tonight. We may not get to everything, so if we don't, we'll follow it up with next week's show. Today is Wednesday, March the 6th, so if you're watching any other time, you're watching a replay. We are live tonight, and we'll be here till 9 o'clock, so thank you so much for tuning in. If you remember from last week's show, we talked about a book of local fire department history here in Rocky Mount. And I was able to get some pictures from that book and a few other sources too. So we're going to get to some of those a little bit later on in the show tonight. Before we get to that though, we're going to cover a little bit of U.S. history. And I say that because there's an individual who's a former Rocky Mount resident he's deceased now in fact. But he had a really impact, a great impact in fact on Rocky Mount many years ago. We'll explain to you who he is shortly. But to tell his story in its full realm, if you will, requires going back many years, back to the 1800s, in fact, and tell a little bit about U.S. history. And so to tell that story, I didn't feel confident, frankly, to go from memory and tell what little bit I did remember about the time right after the Civil War, up until the late 1800s, in fact. And so I went to the Library of Congress online and pulled some documents and kind of put together a little story, if you will. And this is all straight off the Library of Congress website, and specifically talking about what was called then the Compromise of 1877. Okay. There's a lot of ground here I want to cover, and I'm going to try to go through it pretty quickly, so try to follow along. If you got any questions, feel free to give me a call. The number is 407-1111, of course. But we're talking about the Compromise of 1877. Oddly enough, there's some unique parallels between the elections that was taking place in 1876 and what has happened in the last election, presidential election, I should say, in 2020 and now coming up on 2024. And I didn't realize how many parallels there were until I read this article talking about the Compromise of 1877. So without further ado, let's get a little bit, I'm gonna kind of skim through this. I'm gonna put on my helpers here, if you will, because this little small writing's hard for me to read. The Compromise of 1877 was an informal agreement between Southern Democrats and allies of the Republican Rutherford Hayes to settle the result of the 1876 presidential election and marked the end of the Reconstruction era. Immediately after the presidential election of 1876, it became clear that the outcome of the race hinged largely on disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the only three states in the South with Reconstruction-era Republican governments still in power. As a bipartisan congressional commission debated over the outcome early in 1877, allies of the Republican Party candidate, who was Rutherford B. Hayes, met in secret with more moderate Southern Democrats in order to negotiate acceptance of Hayes' election. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' victory on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, thus consolidating Democrat control over the region. As a result of the so-called Compromise of 1877, sometimes referred to as the Compromise of 1876, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina became Democratic once again, effectively bringing an end to the Reconstruction era. It goes on to say, by the 1870s, support was waning for the racially egalitarian policies of the Reconstruction, a series of laws put in place after the Civil War to protect the rights of African Americans, especially in the South. many Southern whites had resorted to intimidation and violence to keep blacks from voting and restore white supremacy in the region. Beginning in 1873, a series of Supreme Court decisions limited the scope of Reconstruction-era laws and federal support for the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the status of citizenship, the protection of the Constitution, including the right to vote. It goes on. In addition, accusations of corruption within the administration of Ulysses S. Grant and an economic depression had heightened discontent with the Republican Party, which had been in the White House since 1861. If you remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. As the 1876 presidential election approached, the Democrats chose Governor Samuel B. Tilden of New York as their candidate, while the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio. In his acceptance of the nomination, Hayes wrote that if elected, he would bring the blessings of honest and capable self-government to the South. In other words, he would restrict federal enforcement of unpopular Reconstruction-era policies. On Election Day that November, the Democrats appeared to come out on top, winning the swing states of Connecticut, Indiana, New York, and New Jersey. By midnight, Tilden had 184 of the 185 electoral votes he needed to win and was leading the popular vote by 250,000 votes. The Republicans refused to accept defeat, however, and accused Democrat supporters of intimidating and bribing African American voters to prevent them from voting in 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. As of 1876, these were the only remaining states in the South with Republican governments. In South Carolina, the election had been marred by bloodshed on both sides of the party line. Supporters of the Democrat gubernatorial candidate Wade Hampton, a former Confederate general, had used violence and intimidation to confront the African American voting majority. A clash between black militia and armed whites in Hamburg in July ended in the death of 5 militiamen after their surrender while at Camboy near Charleston. 6 white men were killed when armed blacks opened fire in a political meeting. With both sides accusing each other of electoral fraud, South Carolina, along with Florida and Louisiana, submitted 2 sets of election returns with different results. Meanwhile, in Oregon, the state's Democratic governor placed a Republican elector with a Democrat, alleging that the Republican had been ineligible, thus throwing Hayes' victory in that state into question as well. Compromise of 1877, Congress steps in. To resolve the dispute, Congress set up an electoral commission in January of 1877 consisting of 5 U.S. representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. The commissioners' members included 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent, Justice David Davis. When Davis refused to serve, the moderate Republican Justice Joseph Bradley was chosen to replace him. During the commission's deliberations, Hayes' Republican allies met in secret with moderate Southern Democrats in hopes of convincing them not to block the official counting of votes through filibuster and effectively allow Hayes' election. In February, at a meeting held in Washington's Wormley Hotel, the Democrats agreed to accept Hayes' victory and to respect the civil and political rights of African Americans on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, thus consolidating Democrat control in the region again. Hayes appointed Tennessee's David Key as Postmaster General, but never followed through on the promised land grant for Texas and the Pacific. Within 2 months, Hayes had ordered federal troops from their posts guarding Louisiana and South Carolina state houses, allowing Democrats to seize control in both of those states. As Florida Supreme Court had earlier declared a Democrat victory in the 1876 gubernatorial election, Democrats had restored power all across the South. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended the Reconstruction era. Southern Democrats promised to protect civil and political rights of black people were not kept, and the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters. From the late 1870s onward, Southern legislatures passed a series of laws requiring the separation of whites from persons of color on public transportation, in schools, parks, restaurants, theaters, and other locations. known as Jim Crow laws, after a popular minstrel act developed in the antebellum years. Those segregationist statutes governed life in the South through the middle of the next century, ending only after the hard-won successes of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So just to kind of go over this, the presidential election of 1876 was hotly contested. The Democrats believed stated publicly their candidate had won. The Republicans, of course, said their candidate won. But there was some 3 states that were in dispute: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. There was so much dispute, in fact, that those 3 states submitted 2 sets of election results. So, how are you going to determine a winner if you've got 2 sets of election results, basically two different outcomes of the presidential election in those 3 states? And so this compromise of 1877 got together, Republicans, Democrats got together, okay, look, we'll let Rutherford B. Hayes take over the presidency, which is astounding in itself, because at the end of the election, at least by the numbers that were being provided, the Democrat candidate was 250,000 votes ahead in the popular election, and he was ahead in the electoral count too. But that being said, the Democrats agreed that if the Republicans would remove the federal troops from the South, then they would accept Rutherford B. Hayes as the president, and so they did. Unfortunately, when the Democrats took back over control of the South, particularly in those 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, these Jim Crow laws started coming into existence that was restricting everything to do with African Americans, from being able to mingle with whites, to be on public transportation with whites, to be in public schools with whites. The Jim Crow law is something being discussed to this day, and the negative effect it had on African Americans in this country. And without dispute, they were horrible laws, and it was horrible that such laws were allowed to be implemented. But again, the Democrats had the power in the South. They had the power, and they used that power to implement these Jim Crow laws, and thus keep a pretty heavy thumb, if you will, on African Americans in the South. Okay, so having set that backdrop, there was some black educators that felt very strongly that the key to breaking through all this was education. Obviously, it was hard to get young black people in schools. They were restricted quite a bit by some of the laws that were in place. And so those blacks who had been to school but gotten educated were very instrumental in trying to get schools started, to get government funding to get schools going all throughout the South. And there was a book that I've stumbled across, and I'm going to read a short excerpt out of this book here. It was called "Schooling the Movement, the Activism of Southern Black Educators from Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Era." And it talks about a gentleman named Oliver Pope. It says, Oliver Pope taught in Templeton, Virginia for 3 years when his lesson on Reconstruction cost him his job in 1908. The white superintendent, who was a former Confederate soldier, walked into the classroom as Pope was in the middle of a lesson with his back turned to the door. He recalled the following details. We were discussing the Reconstruction period when he entered without my knowledge, as I was defending, contrary to our text curriculum that day, the congressional plan. If the Negro had not been given the right to vote at that time, a sharp "then what" interrupted me, and I turned startled and confused. Having been caught off guard, it was too late to change course after the voice behind him disrupted the lesson. Recognizing the superintendent, Pope invited him to address the class. The red-faced soldier turned on his heels, Pope explained, and walked out with military dignity. And then I knew my name was Ichabod. Another way of saying my name was Mud. I knew I'd had it, basically. He said Pope's teaching contract was terminated shortly after that incident. So this black educator in the classroom telling these young black kids about how important the right to vote was and how instrumental it would be in their lives. When he began telling that, which was contrary to the curriculum, and a white administrator of the school walked in on the class and heard this lecture, that put in wheels in motion that eventually, very shortly thereafter, in fact, caused this black teacher to lose his job. That was in 1908. Okay, so if the teacher's name didn't ring a bell with you, I'll repeat his name. His name was Oliver Pope. More commonly known as Oliver Rothschild Pope. Mr. Pope was born in 1876. He died in 1973, and he lived a good portion of his life right here in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. In fact, in 1976, Mr. R.D. Armstrong, many of you remember Mr. Armstrong, wrote a very, very good column weekly in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and it was basically about the black community in Rocky Mount. And so by this time, in 1976, of course, Mr. Pope had passed away, but Mr. R.D. Armstrong wrote a very nice article, and it's a very long article, and I'm not going to attempt to read the whole thing, but I want to pick out some points here to kind of share with you some of the highlights from this article that Mr. Armstrong put together in 1976 talking about Mr. Oliver Pope. And he said, the request of Negroes in Rocky Mount, while not flatly denied, as was the case in some communities, was taken into consideration. The second request was ignored. The third request was answered by a visit of the chairman of the school board in person. That was the story of the beginning of Negro schools in Rocky Mount. The dawn of the development of the Negro schools had begun here around the turn of the century. Rocky Mount at that time was a sprawling little city, which the 1910 census showed was the fastest growing city in the United States. How about that? In 1910, Rocky Mount was the fastest growing city in the country. It resembled a changing Midwestern town in earlier years. The business and residential areas were divided then as now by the Atlantic Coastline's main railroad line. In the Happy Hills section of the town, which is on the Nash County side of the railroad, stood a plain, one-story, rambling, gray-painted frame building that was the birthplace of the Negro Public School. The building was located in the middle of a large tract of land bounded by Thomas Street on the south, Gray Street on the east, Gay Street on the north, and a short street on the west known as Middle Street. In the tract of land was a wide ditch that jutted beneath a portion of the frame building, and that was the site for the athletes to perform their skills of broad jumping. It was a sport for the boys then and rivaled the popularity of the Friday afternoon spelling bees. The old frame building had 7 classrooms and had been moved to the colored school from the old West School on Pearl Street. Included in the 7 rooms was an assembly room which was made available through a canvas that rolled up and down. A portion of the building was destroyed by early morning fire in December 1918. The remaining portion, which had been moved there from another school, was placed into use on a half-day class schedule. To supplement the growing attendance, 2 other buildings, the old Mount Zion First Baptist Church, then located on Pearl Street, and the Oddfellows Hall on West Thomas Street, were used. Both makeshift classrooms were in close proximity to what is now known as Lincoln School. Now keep in mind, this is in 1976. All 3 units were operated on a half-day schedule, which had an average daily attendance of 227. The school census showed at that time, in 1911, there were 1,200 eligible to be enrolled. It goes on to say the independent school, some of these kids were enrolled in the independent school on East Holly Street across town from the public school. The independent school, based on the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, was organized and operated by the late J.B. Harper. Washington, who had spoken here a few years before the turn of the century, called for industrial training, but Negro leaders were fanned into a flame and wanted an education like other people, meaning like white people. Negroes were advised that the chairman of the board was studying the feasibility of a Negro high school. It was during the time the school board was studying the request of the tired of waiting Negroes for a public school to accommodate their children that the industrial independent high school emerged. And the first building was a frame structure, which later became Rocky Mount's first brick school for Negro children. History recalls that the independent school was intended to spur the white citizens into giving Negroes a high school. It goes on to talk about some of the folks involved. Mr. R.M. Wilson was involved in this school process, getting the school going. So later, the independent school was closed and the building became part of the Rocky Mount school system. The handsome new elementary school on Coleman Avenue, which was named in honor of Professor O.R. Pope, replaced the old structure of the independent school. The first four-year high school at Lincoln High School was the class of 1928. It was also the last class before the school was moved to a new building on East Virginia Street and became Booker T. Washington High School. So, and it goes on. This is a fairly long article, but I kind of wanted to set the picture there. Very early in this city's development, in the early 1900s anyway, I won't say early development of the city, but in the early 1900s, there was a push to get young blacks educated because the belief was, and still is for that matter, that education was the key. It was the key to get blacks to be self-supporting. It was the key to get them able to to better their lives and their families' lives, and that was something that was a very goal that was very much on the minds of educators across the country, and in particular black educators. And so along comes Mr. Oliver Rothschild Pope. He came to Rocky Mount in 1911, I think it was, or 1912, excuse me, and there was some really good information I found about Mr. Pope. His education, let me read this to you. This is fairly short here. Principal Oliver R. Pope graduated from Bennett College and furthered his education at Teachers College and the University of Chicago. He worked at the Rocky Mount schools from 1912 to 1949, serving as a principal for 37 years. He was elected president of the North Carolina Teachers Association in the mid-1930s, and the O.R. Pope Elementary School in Rocky Mount is named in his honor. In 1967, his memoir, Chalk Dust, Pope describes the selection process for Booker T. Washington High School's invitation to join the secondary school study. And it goes like this. The participating schools in the secondary school study were selected upon the same basis as the famous 30-school study. Prior to this, and like it, the study was underwritten by a General Board of Education. For weeks, I had watched the selection of the schools, hoping that our school would be one of the 16. Then one morning, my almost dead hope came leaping to life. A telephone call and a special delivery letter with a few hours later asked me to see the superintendent about accepting the invitation. I almost tripped on my way to Mr. Banner's office, the superintendent at that time. His brusque reply shocked me. I don't think much of that study, he said. It seems to be an offshoot of progressive education. And above all, he said, I think you've tampered with the course of study too much already, and that our new 12-year program of studies is adequate for any future ventures you'd like to make. Pope, give me one good reason, he added challengingly, why your school should participate. Just one, to be chosen as one of 16 from hundreds of schools throughout the South, I replied, is an honor, and it's difficult to believe that the General Education Board would underwrite a questionable project. Also, the invitation honors you, Mr. Banner. You have made the invitation possible because of your liberal attitude, but your judgment in this matter is good enough for me. His objections disappeared so quickly that I suddenly felt they had not been real anyway. So the point being that Mr. Pope did everything in his power to advance local education, to advance the local schools. And I just realized we've gone past our first commercial break. So let's go ahead, Lee, and take that break. When I come back, I'm going to show you some pictures, get you a little more information about Mr. Pope, let you meet him, so to speak. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Wayback Wednesday. Take it away, Lee.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
Are you looking for the perfect space for your business in Rocky Mount? Discover the individual offices available on the 4th floor of the Healthview Capitol building in downtown Rocky Mount. These offices provide a professional environment with stunning views, ample natural light, and modern amenities in a secure environment. Join a community of thriving businesses and elevate your company to new heights. Rent includes utilities and Wi-Fi, and for an additional fee, you can have access to the building's gym. Schedule a tour today by calling Leanne Wester at 252-977-1616, extension 1012.
Okay, we're back. I want to apologize, first of all. I didn't mean to take as long as I did going over all the past history, but I wanted to set the stage, if you will. There was so much negativity around, particularly in discussions about educating young black people in the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly in the South. And so Mr. Pope, Oliver Pope, had already lost one job in Virginia because he dared challenge the curriculum that was in place at the time. And so, for a lot of people, that would have been enough to say, okay, well, look, this is a too touchy subject. I'm not going to continue on this. I'll just stick with the given curriculum that's in front of me, and we'll go from there. But not to be dismayed, Mr. Pope carried on. And by the way, let's go ahead and put up item number one. This is his picture, by the way. This is Mr. Oliver Rothschild Pope. Like I said, he was born in 1876. He died in 1973. And by the way, I submitted this man's name today to the Twin County Hall of Fame. I first went there and looked to see if someone else had nominated him. He had never been nominated. Most folks in Rocky Mount have no idea who this gentleman is. And frankly, I never knew who O.R. Pope Elementary School was named for. I never knew anything about Mr. Pope here. But the more I found out about him, the more I was convinced that his contributions to Rocky Mount and to education, particularly education of young blacks in this area, was important enough that he was certainly worthy and should be included into the Twin County Hall of Fame. So I nominated him today. We'll see how that goes. I think the selection process takes place in September, so it'll be several months before we know. But if you know anybody that's involved with the Twin County Hall of Fame, you might want to put a bug in their ear that Mr. Oliver Rothschild Pope certainly deserves to be there. Okay, I found some pictures, neat pictures. This one, number 2, Lee, this is from, this appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 2011, but it's actually from the early 1900s, and it's really dark. I apologize for the darkness of the photograph here. But that's Mr. Pope right in the center there, and the caption reads, Principal Oliver R. Pope, Rear Center, poses with the faculty of Lincoln School for a portrait taken in the early 1900s. The faculty members are from left to right: Tempe Wimberly Thorpe, Maud Phillips, Pope, and Susie Hagan. Seated at left is Katie Bunn. The others are unidentified. But this was the early 1900s, and this was when he was actually principal at the old Abraham Lincoln School. And so we'll move on from there. Lead number 3, if you would. This picture appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 2013, but it's actually from 1915. And I believe that's Mr. Pope on the far left-hand side. It says, Principal Oliver R. Pope with the Lincoln School faculty circa 1915. The Telegram is partnering with local historians and merchants to commemorate black history in the Twin Counties. Like I say, this was from 2013, 11 years ago. I had not seen this picture before, but certainly his contributions cannot be overstated. Number 4, Lee, this came out in the Robisonian, which is a Lumberton newspaper, in 1920. And it says, Instructors for Teachers Summer School for Colored. The following have been secured as instructors for the Teachers Summer School for Colored to be held at Thompson Institute in Lumberton. Professor O.R. Pope, Principal Rocky Mount Graded School, Grammar School subjects, and it goes on to list the other ones. But again, he was very instrumental. He was willing to travel. He left this area, of course, and went down to Lumberton. He went to Greensboro on occasion. Number 5, if you would, Lee. This article appeared. It's kind of hard to read. I'm just going to kind of glaze over it here. The title reads, The Negro College. The white friends and supporters of the Agricultural and Technical College at Greensboro, the institution at which is an agricultural and mechanical education is provided to the Negro youth of the state, are putting up an effective protest against the $20,000 annual maintenance fund suggested by the Budget Commission. Pamphleted endorsement is given to the protest by such men as Dr. Claxton of the United States Department of Education, James H. Young, R.H. McKenzie, O.R. Pope, and the name goes on and on. The gist of this article says that these people were literally offended at the measly amount of money that was being offered for this Negro college. They said, look, $20,000 is not enough. We need more money. These kids need a good education, and we believe that this money is insufficient and inadequate to provide the education these young kids need. And again, just an example of Mr. Oliver Pope's determination to better the educational system, not just for black kids. You know, his effort was focused in the black community, but his teaching ideals and his policies and tactics were used for many, many years and benefited both black kids and white kids. Number 6, Lee, this is one of the few pictures I've ever seen of the Abraham Lincoln School. I remember this school. I never knew it was also a high school at one time, but before Booker T. Washington opened up, this was the black high school. Now, by the 1960s or so, it became an elementary school, and so it was over, of course, on the corner of Grace and Thomas Street there. There's another building there now. I think OIC has got the whole building, but this was Abraham Lincoln School, one of many schools that Oliver Pope was involved with over the years. Number 7, Lee, this is another picture from the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1949. Oddly enough, this was the same year Oliver Pope left the area. He was already in his 70s by now, and he had put forth a tremendous effort. He and his family ended up moving to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and that's where he was living upon his demise in 1976. But this picture appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1949. Okay, Lee, number 8, the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1962, Mr. R.D. Armstrong had another one of his articles, News About Negroes, that's what it was called, and he was very good about highlighting events and happenings and so forth that occurred in the African American community here locally that otherwise would have gone unreported. It's safe to say, had it not been for Mr. Armstrong, a lot of the news that was important to the African American community locally would not have made it to the newspaper. But in 1962, it says Mr. and Mrs. O.R. Pope, former Rocky Mount residents, celebrated their golden wedding anniversary at their home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania last week. Mr. Pope served as a supervising principal at the Negro schools here for 37 years, and after his retirement in 1949, moved to Pennsylvania City, where his daughter, Ms. Juanita Morrissey, and his son, Oliver R. Pope Jr., were living. That's interesting because I'm going to show you in a minute the obituary for Oliver Pope and his wife. Neither one mentions their daughter, and when I found his grave site on the Find a Grave website, his daughter wasn't listed there either. I'm not sure why. There's no explanation I could find anyway. But anyway, it says a large number of Rocky Mount citizens and former associates of Mr. and Ms. Pope attended the celebration, including the group, and it goes on to list several prominent educators, teachers, doctors, and so forth from not only North Carolina, but also Philadelphia. Number 9, Lee. This article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in May of 1967. The O.R. Pope School is named in honor of Oliver R. Pope, a patient Negro principal and educator. Original construction was completed in 1938 with Walter G. Byers as the first principal. The school, staffed with 13 teachers, had an enrollment of about 600. As enrollment increased from 1945 to 1950, students had to be transferred after finishing the 5th grade. After Montera Davis became principal in 1945, 8 classrooms as well as a gymatorium were needed. Steadily, the roll climbed to 900. The erection of the Susie Baskerville School took many of the students and teachers from Pope School. When Parker Junior High was finished in 1961, enrollment further decreased. Upon the retirement of Davis in 1964, Thomas Walter Williams took over the position of principal. Williams now heads a staff of 16 and enrollment of 843. Again, this is from 1967. At that point, O.R. Pope, as an educational facility, was already on a decline, primarily because of new school openings at Baskerville, at J.W. Parker, and D.S. Johnson. Okay, Lee. 1967 was also an interesting year because Mr. Pope wrote a book. It was called Chalk Dust, and it kind of chronicles his life in the educational community and particularly educating young blacks. The subtitle reads, An Autobiographical Account of a Dedicated Negro Teacher to Educate and Mold Young Lives. This book, I found it online. Several places have copies of it, ranging in price from $50 all the way to $200. But it's still being used today as an educational tool. He's quoted multiple times. I saw several references to his book on websites I visited today and yesterday while I researched for tonight's show. It's just really interesting that decades after his death, his work and his book and his ideals of teaching are still being used and used as models today. Number 11, Lee, December 18, 1973, Mr. Pope's obituary appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. It says funeral services will be conducted at 8 p.m. tonight for Oliver Rothschild Pope, 97, who died Saturday. Services will be conducted from the Camphor Methodist Church in Philadelphia. And it says surviving are his mother. His mother did not survive him. That was a misprint because his wife's name was Myrtle. I know that. And so it meant to say surviving is his wife. And here it does list his daughter. I apologize, I said earlier it did not. It does list his daughter here. But this is the only place other than what I saw earlier that his daughter was listed. So we'll move on, Lee. Sadly, a few short years, 6 years later, Mrs. Pope, and again, you see there her name was Myrtle. Ms. Myrtle Pope, former principal of Oliver R. Pope Senior Elementary School. So her husband was instrumental in getting that school started. She later became principal of O.R. Pope Elementary School. And there it says, survivors, one son, Oliver R. Pope Jr., one sister, and that's it, and 49 grandchildren. Well, again, they left out her daughter in the listing here, and she didn't have 49 grandchildren. I know that because I found another obituary the very next day, number 13. I guess someone called and complained and said, look, you got it wrong. This appeared the very next day in the Rocky Mount Telegram. It says, survivors, one son, Oliver R. Pope Jr. of Philadelphia, one sister, and 4 grandchildren. Still no mention of her daughter, or their daughter, I should say. I do know her daughter married a doctor, not a medical doctor. I think he was a doctor of education too. In fact, her daughter was also a teacher. I don't know. I know their son has since passed away. I'm not sure about the daughter. Number 14, Lee. Rocky Mount Telegram had this article in February of 1992, and it talks about Black History Month being taught at O.R. Pope School, and it talks about there was a guest speaker there to talk to the young people there, and she referenced Oliver Pope in her message to the young people. And it said, Jones told the youngsters about the accomplishments of famed black educator Oliver R. Pope, after whom their school was named. Jones personally knew Pope, who was born in Western North Carolina in 1876. Actually, born in 1873, there's a typo there as well. In 1912, he and his bride accepted a call to Rocky Mount. He would stay for 37 years, organizing and leading the black school system as principal of Booker T. Washington High School and Lincoln School. Fighting for equal education, he not only helped rebuild a near-defunct school system, but made it one of the best of its kind in the South. Pope wrote about those 37 years of innovation and struggled to develop the black schools referred to as the Duration Negro School System in his autobiographical account, Chalk Dust. Citing the example of Pope, Jones told the children, if there is no role model for you, you have to rise up to be your own role models. You can be who you want to be. And so again, decades after his death, Oliver Pope's message was still resonating within the educational community, and students were still hearing about him. I see by the clock on the wall, it is now time for our next commercial, so I'm going to try not to scoot past this one. Lee, let's go ahead and do that commercial break, and we'll get back on track here. When I come back, I've got a few more things to share with you about Mr. Pope, and then we'll jump into some old fire pictures from that book I told you about last week. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Wayback Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
There's a main nerve that leaves your back that goes into your hip and goes down your leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. A back injury can put pressure on that nerve, causing pain, numbness, tingling. Chiropractors can actually help that. At the Hammer Chiropractic Center on Sunset, we know exactly what to do. We have very good relationships with the doctors in Rocky Mount. We like to co-manage people's care. Some medications may help us do our jobs, and our jobs may help their medications work better.
Are you looking for the perfect space for your business in Rocky Mount? Discover the individual offices available on the 4th floor of the Healthview Capitol building in downtown Rocky Mount. These offices provide a professional environment with stunning views, ample natural light, and modern amenities in a secure environment. Join a community of thriving businesses and elevate your company to new heights. Rent includes utilities and Wi-Fi, and for an additional fee, you can have access to the building's gym. Schedule a tour today by calling Leanne Wester at 252-977-1616, extension 1012.
So just to recap, I spent a lot of time at the top of the show talking about history, but it was important to kind of set the stage, if you will. And it kind of speaks to me about what kind of man O.R. Pope was. To even venture into the field of education, particularly educating young blacks in the late 1800s, early 1900s, took a fair amount of intestinal fortitude, shall we say. It was certainly an uphill battle, there's no doubt about that. But his determination to see a better life, I never read any instance where he engaged in anything that could remotely be considered violence or, he was, by most accounts, he was a very strict man, but very fair. His students, respected him immensely, and so did his fellow teachers and the teachers who worked under him when he was principal. So it just goes to show, what one's able to accomplish with the right mindset, I guess is a better way to say it. So let's move on, Lee. Number 15, the Rocky Mount Telegram had this article appeared in 2014. Sadly, O.R. Pope School closed. It was really in bad shape. It was in the bad state of disrepair. There was leaking roofs, there was unsafe conditions, and they made a decision to close the school. And there was a committee put together to explore possible uses for the school after its closing. And as one might imagine, there was an outcry, particularly amongst the black community, to keep the school open, to spend whatever money it would take to renovate it, to make it back new again. But the school board looked at this thing at some length and said, hey, it's just in too bad a shape. And that's a sad commentary too. You think about the pyramids have been around for thousands and thousands of years. The Great Wall of China been around for hundreds of years. And so much world history of buildings and so forth that have been managed to be salvaged, if you will, and remain in use after hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. And I think sometimes we as a society are just too quick to say, let's just tear it down and build something else there. But in any case, 2014 decision was made to close Pope Elementary School, and it's basically sat vacant for a number of years since then. Number 16, Lee, this picture was current as of 2021, and the school from the outside really doesn't look that bad. But like I said, there was some issues, safety issues that were just too big to overcome. And so one thing I did find out, the school has been purchased by a church, basically. And so I'm not sure what their plans are. I'm not sure if they're even using it yet, but it has been purchased. And so maybe they'll turn something out with this building. I'd love to see that happen. The school's got a lot of history, obviously. It's approaching 100 years old, built in 1938, so another 10 years or so, it'll be 13 years, it'll be 100 years old. So I think there's probably some life still in that school. I like to think so anyway. Okay, I mentioned at the top of the show we'll talk about some pictures. I went through that book that Eric Dawson let me borrow, and there was so many pictures in there. It was neat just going back to those old pictures. I saw so many folks I knew, people I went to school with, became firemen in later years. I know some watch the show, so if you're watching and you're a prior fireman, retired fireman now, most of all of you that were my age, I salute you. There's no more noble profession in my mind than that of a firefighter. And sadly, it's there's been a kind of shift, if you will. I think the firefighters would tell you the same thing. And like so many other things, it's not like it used to be. But that being said, Rocky Mountain Fire Department has a rich and storied history, and there were some really neat stories, neat articles, neat pictures. So we'll jump right into them. Lead number 17. This was the 1896 steamer. It was purchased by the city of Rocky Mount in 1896 for a price tag of $2,600. When this picture was put in that book, and I think that book came out around 1995, but at that time it says this thing was being stored in station number 4. I'm not sure if that's still true or not. I didn't go try to verify that. But the city does still have it, I'm certain of that. Number 18, Lee, this was a horse-drawn steam pumper. It used steam pressure to drive a pump and pump water to fight fires. And here you see, and this picture was undated, but it was out front of the old station number 1 and on Main Street. I'm guessing this is probably from the 1940s maybe. I think it was a picture probably to illustrate how the thing would have been used. I don't think it was, I'm pretty sure this picture was, just looking by the clothing the gentlemen are wearing, they look like too modern to have been the same era of when this unit would have been in use in the 1880s. Number 19, Lee, Rocky Mount's first bucket brigade was organized in 1896. And it says the first town council approved bucket brigade, the Bucket Brigade Fire Company was March the 11th of 1896. This station was located in the 100 block of East Thomas Street, and it lists all the men there, and they are, it's hard to tell in this picture, every one of these gentlemen are African American. I didn't realize that the very first Bucket Brigade Fire Department of Rocky Mount was all African American. That's not to say that every fireman was African American, but this was what they called the Bucket Brigade, and they were all African Americans. Number 20, Lee, this picture we have actually shared on the show before. In fact, not too terribly long ago, we shared this picture. This was taken in the 1920s. This station number 2, that is now the Fire Museum, the building to the right, has been several things. The last thing that was there that we remember was Marx Brothers Tire. The building has since been torn down. But if you recall from a show a few weeks back, there was a house there prior to that brick building being there on the right, and it was torn down, and this building was built, and there was 3 or 4 businesses in there before it was eventually demolished sometime in the 1970s, I think it was. Okay, Lee, number 21. This was a man-powered hook and ladder unit, and this dates back to the late 1800s as well. This is still in, the City of Rocky Mount is still in ownership of this device. Says it's in storage and still owned by the fire department. Doesn't say where it's in storage at, but the fire department still got it. You know, as a small child, I used to look forward to the Christmas parades to see Santa Claus, number 1, but also to see Sparky the fire dog. And number 22, Lee, when I saw this picture, I couldn't help but smile. This, of course, is Sparky. This picture taken from 1951, and I think this might have been a parade in association with Fire Prevention Week. I'm not sure that it was a Christmas parade per se. Too many leaves on that tree behind here to be in December or even November. So I'm thinking this was Fire Prevention Week, probably in the spring of the year, 1951. And this was a Charlie Killebrew pick, by the way. This was not in that book. I just stumbled across this looking for other things and thought I would add it to it. Same with this next picture, number 23. This is also a Charlie Killebrew pick from 1951. And it's the same steam pumper we saw a minute ago being pulled by a horse. And I have a sneaky suspicion that this may have been the same setup, if you will, with the same horse and same, well, I know it's the same steam pumper, but it may have been the same one we saw a few pictures ago that was out in front of the old firehouse on Main Street. But anyway, okay, there were several fires shown, pictures of fires in that book, and some of them were just devastating. Number 24, Lee, this was the ACL Freight Depot fire that occurred January 17th in 1958. Before my time, I can't say I remember this, but this was what the building looked like after the fire from the outside. This is, by the way, located on Bassett Street, as I said. Said fire consumed this building belonging to the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad on January the 17th, 1958. Building was, of course, located on Bassett Street. Number 25, Lee, this was a picture inside that same building, and you see, it's amazing this thing just didn't completely go away. The whole roof, of course, was wood, and you see how badly it burned and how those beams stood up under that immense heat when everything around it burned. It's unbelievable. But the devastation was quite total, as you can see. Okay, I mentioned the fire station on Main Street. In 1964, this picture, number 26, if you would, Lee, this picture was taken, and it says Fire Station Number 1, Headquarters Station. This is thought to be one of the last pictures taken before its demolition, in 1964. You see the bell tower there. It's a neat old picture. I've seen this picture many times. The bell tower with the bell in the top up there. Number 27, Lee, this picture was actually taken at the same time frame, 1964, and it shows a shot inside the fire station to your left there, and of course the outside picture to the right. I'm not certain, but I believe that picture on the left shows the fire pole there in the middle, just to the left of the fire truck in this picture. As a small boy, I thought that would have been the coolest thing in the world, to slide down a fire pole as a fireman. I never got a chance to do that, but I always admired those who did it, and was always a bit jealous of those who had a job of being able to slide down a fire pole to go to work. Okay, Lee, number 28. As I said, 1964 is when the demolition began on the old firehouse, and sadly the wrecking ball hit this thing and began taking it down little by little. The bell was salvaged. We'll get to that in a minute. I'll show you a picture of the bell. But this picture was taken in 1964 as demolition was begun on the old firehouse, station number 1 originally on Main Street. Okay, Lee, number 29. This picture is taken from a Fire Prevention Week parade. It was undated, so I don't know what year this was. I'm going to guess probably 1950s, maybe 1960s. They're standing in front of an old 1919 American LaFrance aerial truck. Obviously by this time was no longer in use. There were much more modern trucks around in use by this time. But this old fire engine was in the parade this year, and I'm not sure, like I said, it was undated, but I'm guessing it was in the 1950s. Okay, Lee, August 12th, 1967. Many of you remember the fire at Tarrytown Mall. I sure do. I was living very close to there when this fire occurred, and I remember it quite vividly. I mean, there was an awful lot of chatter around town about the fire, and you see the firemen at the end of the ladder pouring fire down on the mall. The first mall in Eastern North Carolina, located in Rocky Mount, burned August 12, 1967, causing major damage to most of the businesses. Number 31, Lee, this was taken inside the mall, and I'm not sure whether this brightness is because it was seeing daylight. I'm guessing what it was. I don't think it would be this bright from fire and this fireman being this close to it, so I'm guessing this was daylight we're seeing here. The caption reads, "Inside views after the fire looked very grim for the businesses which remained. Montgomery Ward, which is the only store still located in the mall," now keep in mind this is 1967, still located in the mall, escaped serious damage. Rose's, Car Drug, and Mason stores were also lucky. So, you know, there was quite a bit of damage, and it was amazing how quickly Tarrytown Mall came back. You know, had it not been for Hurricane Floyd in 1999, who knows, Tarrytown Mall might still be in business. But Floyd, sadly, was a demise of Tarrytown Mall. Okay, Lee, number 22. This picture appeared as a fire took place in 1971 at Sexton and Sons Feed Store, which is located on the corner of Falls Road and Gay Street. The fire, as I said, was 1971. They moved the business to 218 North Church Street after this fire, but I don't think it lasted very long after that. I don't remember when it went out of business, but I think Sexton and Son has been gone many years now. Lastly, 1976, November 27th, one of the deadliest fires in Rocky Mount fire history occurred when the Terminal Hotel caught fire and burned. November 27th, 1976. Number 33, if you would, Lee. This is a picture from the night of the fire, when the firemen were fighting the fire. And it says the second most fatal fire in the history of Rocky Mount Fire Department, and was this fire, Terminal Hotel, November 27, 1976. The hotel was located beside the bus station on South Washington Street. I can't say I have a real good recollection of this. I went to the bus station many times. During this time frame, I was working at Davidson Company Auto, not Davidson Company, I was working at Chipley Lincoln Mercury, excuse me. And quite often we would use the bus station to ship parts. I would go pick up parts there, in fact, and go take parts to be shipped out. It was really common back in those days to use the bus to ship. This was before UPS and DHL, those places became very prominent. But anyway, I can't say I remember this building. Needless to say, it was a terrible fire. 4 people died in this fire, by the way. 3 were burned beyond recognition. 2 were found in their rooms, and 2 were found in the hallway, I understand. Number 34, Lee, lastly, this was the outside of the building after the fire. This appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in 1976, November 27th. It says, blaze kills 4. 4 victims died in the fire that destroyed the Terminal Hotel on Main Street early this morning. In the top photo, firemen lower a victim from the 2nd story. And I didn't get that picture, frankly. It was just, I didn't want to air it on the air. And it says, talking about the second picture at the bottom picture is the hotel after the fire. The inside was gutted. The story is on page 1. But anyway, you see it right there by the railroad tracks. The building was a total loss, and sadly, 4 people did lose their life. Okay, folks, that's going to do it for us tonight. I'm sorry I didn't really give much time for phone calls. I wanted to cover as I could about Mr. Pope. I just felt like it was really important to honor the gentleman and his accomplishments. And so for those that didn't know anything about him, like myself, I hope maybe you have a little better appreciation now for what it was like to be a teacher in the Deep South in the late 1800s, early 1900s, particularly teaching young blacks in that time frame. It was so rough. Okay, that's going to do it for us tonight. Have a great week, folks. Take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another, and we'll see you next week with more Wayback Wednesday. Good night.